How would we define those skills, those things that can be transferred into client environments or should be valued much more by chief executives, and the skills that McKinsey don't have? How would we define those skills?
I mean, I kind of repeating what I said earlier. I think to me, planners are, you don't really think planners, creatives or account managers, they're people, and the people are valuable to you in a way the barriers break down quite quickly. And I think the best people are actually good business strategists, work well creative. I think it's about multifaceted, which to me makes it hard. I'm sure it is possible to define a planner and a set of skills, but I think in a way it's more looking at people as opposed to the kind of people who go into planning and how you can make those people be as stimulating and interesting and rewarded as possible, as opposed to looking at, to me, as a discipline, because almost a discipline creates an output of people rather than the other way around. If that makes sense.
I got really interested recently in why our people make great entrepreneurs, and why specifically planners seem to make very good entrepreneurs, because we shouldn't, because we're fucking useless at organising anything, and we're not, as we keep getting beaten up about, we're not particularly commercial. And I look at things like, Matt Boffey's Saint Lager, the Lurpak planner from Wydens, or Tom Callard at our place has created a brand called Love Depot, which was invested in by Peter Jones. Or even, things like David Hyatt launching first Howie's, then the Do Lectures, and now he's revitalising the Welsh jeans manufacturing business. And why do we make great entrepreneurs? Not me, clearly, because I'm still working for the man. But and I think it's because we have this instinctive, and this is what this for me is a transferable skill, an instinctive understanding and joy in the marriage of intangible and tangible stuff. To know, for instance, in the case of those Welsh jeans, that creating an amazing product with great quality denim, with people who've been making it for years in cardigan is important. But so is just this idea that that he's revitalising kind of forgotten industry, and I think that's what we're really good at, taking intangible stuff and tangible stuff and putting it together and seeing the potency and joy in it.
Yeah, I think it's clearly very hard, isn't it? Otherwise, there would be a piece of paper somewhere which said exactly what we do, what you do. Well, I'm not a part of the planning community, but I think it is something about that combination between, that kind of wonderful rigour, that way of structuring and restructuring questions in a way that, by structuring the question in a different way, changes. Let's think of Skins as a youth brand. How does that change the way that we approach it? I think that's wonderfully kind of an exploratory curiosity in the way that questions work. I think it's about having a real source of authority, very often in terms of really understanding and having an insight into the end user in some kind of way, or sometimes the culture of the company, in terms of the kind of curiosity that comes from a desire to kind of unpick what makes a brand or a company special that actually the company itself has forgotten at that point, and you're the one. It's a bunch of different things, and it's that bundle. It's not a list. It's a bundle of things, isn't it? And each of us possess those in different qualities. We spike on different qualities for there, but actually we would recognise all of those in ourselves at our best on the projects we worked on.
Adam, you talked about R&D and the need for agencies to invest in their people and the intellectual capital of agencies. They're mostly not doing that. I'm interested from your outside perspective, and Richard from inside the business. Why not, and how do we persuade them to do that?
So if I was going to be slightly tendentious, which I suppose is the purpose of the evening, I'd say it's because agencies and possibly planning directors are not making the ruthless choices they need to make. So I would say that, for instance, one of planning's dirty little secrets, unless it's changed enormously since I was in it, is that there are about 30, 35, sometimes 40% of creatives in any agency who aren't remotely interested in planning and actually don't do anything with what you come up with. They're going to write the ad, they're going to write anyway. And there's a bunch of clients who aren't really interested in planning either because they've got these wonderful insight departments which have just been rebranded, and they've got all the data and they're going to test it with an old brand. So you know what, just don't put planners on those bits of business or against those creatives. Actually, take some of that money and either hire much, much better planners or have a training budget or an R&D budget and spend that money in a completely different way. You're not going to get someone to pony up I don't know, another kind of 500 grand for you to go and do R&D. You're going to have to find ways of much more inventively, much more creatively, much more ruthlessly making choices about how you spend your money and how you spend your time. And I don't think actually agencies are very good at making choices in that kind of way. One of the reasons I got frustrated with the whole left advertising was because I'd come up with the Challenger concept as a global positioning for TBWA. I got the founders, the T, the B, and the W. The A had unfortunately passed on, so he wasn't able to inform me of his views at that point. I got them to buy into the concept of Challenger. I'd taken 18 months to write this sodding book, and by the time I finished it, they didn't want it anymore because it was restrictive. We might pitch for a market leader, Adam. That might limit our ability to do that. They were just really bad at making choices. And I think this is a time for ruthless choices. And I do think, I completely agree with what Rich is saying about our ability to be transformative thinkers. I just don't think the bigger world knows us for being that. And I think there's a much bigger stage we need to play on, because other people are starting to play on that stage. And unless we make those choices, we're just not going to be at that table in 5 or 10 years' time.
Richard?
I think in part there's an issue about how we are spending our intellectual budget within agencies, and we've got ourselves, and I've written about this in the past, but got ourselves into this model of replicating an account planning, the structure of our account handling departments and not our creative departments. So we put planners on pieces of business. 80%, and every client has a planner and they know who their planner is and they work full time. It's not how we operate our creative departments. And I think that sort of, if we had more freedom to use our budgets in the way that we sought in order to answer clients' problems, rather than meeting client expectations that they will get 80% of a planner full time, we might find both people and money released to do bigger stuff. And I think that's really important. That said, most planners are fantastically curious and imaginative. And, you can get a lot done by adding an IP element into our day jobs. That means that agencies are starting to produce stuff that's important and interesting to client organisations and CMOs that isn't necessarily about today's communication problems. And I think that's entirely possible, and I wish more agencies were doing it. And you can tell they can't, because any time anyone does, they get about 4 pages in campaign to wank off about it.
Cameron, what have you learnt about this role of R&D from the movie industry and how that reflects on advertising?
We did a terrible amount. It's one of the most depressing things we have in our business is the decades of quantitative analysis and data, and some things like you'll get 10 different TV spots, all tested with 200 people, so an extraordinary amount of money on testing it. They'll package it together with, well, this scene and this scene and this scene and this scene works really well, so we're going to put them all together and create the best testing spot. And it's an absolute dog's dinner, because it's just the amount of data and tracking, it doesn't really get you anywhere. I think, to be honest about your point about why do agencies not invest in R&D and research, and we look at Martin Sorrell and how much money he's making, and I see how much money we spend on tracking, which is just because that's what we do. There's a set that actually research creates more work for advertising, you create more money for it, and you pull it apart. Putting it in under one roof, I think, is challenging if you're talking pure R&D, equity, like research. Would you buy the research from your client? I think that's, to me, is the unfortunate thing, is in days when the planners did their own research groups, and that was kind of what you did. I don't know if you do that this day and age, because people go, well, of course the planner's going to say this works really well, of course, because you're not biased, so we need an independent person to come in and do that. And I think it's a shame that you have lost that trust, but I think it's hard to credibly offer anything beyond, when I was head of planning at Tibber, I looked at various initiatives. Can you build IP? Can you build research tools? Can you do weekly focus groups where you just get people in and get planners just to be closer to the customer and just get, develop those skills? But I think the best thing to do is train people in the right way. I did an MBA part-time when I was a planner. I think other people go off and do different skills. And actually, if you can make your planners, the people you have, more interesting and stimulating, you're not quite, in a way, the slight challenge is research suggests a purpose at the end of it. You're trying to find something out. Actually, you can just develop people to have a different perspective, which one day will become interesting. You don't quite know when, which again is that kind of whole quantum outcomes. You don't know quite what you're trying to achieve because you can't put it in a linear process. But if you can invest in your planners to be more interesting people in different ways and find out what do they really like doing. I'm passionate about art and history. That has military strategy has a huge relevance for planning. And if that's what someone's interested in, it's I guess having a more lateral approach to R&D in your people as opposed to a tool or a technique which exists, a Saatchi tool is always a hard thing. No offence.
I'm interested, anyone's got some questions about quantum mechanics and military strategy. Cameron will be able to answer those as well.
Hi, I'm Joe Shaw from Flamingo. I have to confess to being an ex-planner as well, although, once a planner, all that stuff. I left probably before you, Adam, actually. And I'm interested in hearing more about how planners find a voice, because one of the agencies I worked in back in the day, about 600 years ago, was Lowe's. And it had a certain reputation for sort of eating planners and just sort of leaving on the side of the road dead. One day I came to work and there was a big notice on the creative department door saying, "Fuck off, planners." And quite a few planners duly fucked off, and the brave ones amongst us kind of went in. And I remember at the time, the way to get a voice in the creative department was to say something useful, to go in there and to say something the creative team would listen, and they'd say, well, I can write great advertising from that, I can write something from that. And I'm interested in hearing what the panel have got to say about how do planners find that voice. Specifically, actually, in creative terms, if you sort of turn up in a creative office and share something that you think they think is helpful and useful, that seems to be quite clear. But for a client, how do you get that voice now? And also, I'm interested in that Martin Sorrell chart as well, where WPP have just turned over $1 billion. How do you work in a culture that leads to that? And you say, well, you need us, because and in there he's making all that money, the group's making all that money. So how do planners find that voice now?
Who wants to take that first?
I'll go. So I think there are several different kinds of voice. We're talking about voice with the creative department. I'm not proposing to talk about that. Let's talk about the voice with the client. I think Cameron's example is a really good one, actually, which is about, I think one of the difficulties that we all collectively have is that we are very time poor and we're trying to do lots of stuff and we want to be very impressive, and there's a danger that you skim and scan too much, and what you create these kind of balsa wood edifices that we present as strategy. And I think what's interesting about Cameron's point is there are bits that we need to do really thoroughly and really well that become our source of authority. And I think one of the questions for me about planning now, if we're not all doing our own groups, and I understand why we don't want to do our own groups, but what is our source of authority? And clearly that will vary from department to department and agency to agency, depending on your philosophy. Say for a TBWA, it might be I'm a disruption expert. That might be my source of authority as a planning person in that agency. But I bet most of us would describe our source of authority as being completely different, even in the same agency. And I'm not sure that's a good thing. So I think the answer is one of the ways you find your voice, because your voice is a combination of being listened to and a belief, right? Nobody's going to listen to you unless you believe in yourself and you believe in what you're doing. There's that level of kind of certainty and conviction and energy that you bring to the storytelling Cameron was talking about that is a large part of that voice. That comes from just a kind of degree of thoroughness and really knowing what you're doing and knowing where your source of authority is, either because the agency decides that's what it's going to be for a planner, or because you've made a decision that actually this is what this client needs. The client needs me to really understand where their brand has come from, or understand what their staff culture is about, or whatever it happens to understand why their product is so brilliant. It doesn't really matter, but you're going to find that source of confidence, that rock on which you're going to build it, I think. And unless you have the time and the energy and the certainty to do that, you're not going to find it.
I guess I'll answer that by a couple of examples of what worked when I was on the planning side, and I think both of them do stem from, unfortunately, repeating the same message about getting that kind of consumer perspective. I think one of which was 118 when they had their brand strategy. They wanted to be a challenger brand. They liked Adam's work immensely and wanted to challenge 192's dominance of a whole range of great new services about how you can call up for traffic information, you can call up for... We're not a direct inquiries about last century. We're a multimedia information service where we can provide you any information you want all around the world. Which they had, and part of it was how do you then, the first focus group, and you kind of go, okay, interesting, we'll knock up a brief because the client seems to be obsessed about this. And they originally wanted to call it 118-551, and the 551 made up assist, and again in a really complicated American way because Americans use those kind of numbers as letters. So it was a baffling brand strategy in the first place. But you put it into research groups because you do, and you want to test and be respectful for your client. And is there a possibility? Literally, I remember the first focus group I ran, and it was okay, you do use introductions, and then you go, okay, we're here to talk about direct inquiries. And people literally looked at the watch and said, well, for an hour and a half. And the key insight there was communicating back to them is, look, this is all about, in a way, you are such a low interest category, celebrate that. And building out of that is essentially, because you're a low interest category, actually, your creative opportunity is almost inversely proportional to how interesting your client is. I think my Leon Joan at WHS would talk about the ad for the first water-powered car would be the world's first water-powered car. You don't need to be any more creative, because that's an interesting fact. Something like 118 is an incredibly boring category. It's basically a new number for 192. How to do that in a really memorable way, that's creative. And even, actually, that was with a client was buying that insight, which is, oh, rather than saying you're wrong, it's just we've done this, we've looked at it, we've come up with loads of ideas which bring this to life. But this is what they've told us, so let's brainstorm how do we go with this. So it becomes actually you empowering your client to come to the answer with you, as opposed to you're giving them a solution. You should never tell the client they're wrong, because you should end when they're wrong. It's always just bad form. But how do you get them to realise actually there's another answer for them? I think I can't remember the other example I had to mind, but it was to me it is about actually the voice. Actually, as Heinz, we're looking at pitching for baby food, and I think in a way often it's when you're pitching for something that you can either get it really right or get it completely wrong, and quite often you kind of think you come up with a great insight that's been discovered a million times before. But working with Heinz at baby food is really understanding what motivated mums, and spending, doing a dozen focus groups with mums, and the clients hadn't really done it. They'd read the reports and they'd read the PowerPoints and they had the presentations, but we never really sat and actually got under how do mums feel about baby food? How do they feel about what is a gold standard? What does organic mean versus homemade? And actually coming up out of that was an opportunity to say mum's own is a gold standard, not organic. Organic is a proxy. But then you kind of go, so how do we work for this to make it into a product? And then sitting down and actually launching an entire range of mum's own baby food inspired by Mother and Baby, where mums are sending their recipes and they've worked with the chefs, and you bring that to life as a whole communications platform. But that's something by providing a bit of stimulus, a bit of fresh perspective. You then sit down and you're there with the client, and everyone's going, no one knows where this idea came from. It's not me, the planner. I always struggled with the APG papers. There's always a slight focus on what did I do, what are the planning, what is my fundamental contribution in this. And actually, I think the good planning is you do have a unique insight. You do find out the stuff you pulled out about the 40 miles an hour, 80% of kids will die, and the flip side. You find some insights, but in a way it's like, that's interesting, let's put it into conversation, and then you create something, that's when the magic happens. It's having those is consumer insights and those unique perspectives, which I think genuinely, as a slight outside of the business, you have those perspectives that could be interesting.
Well, no, I'm not going to add to that. I think, for me, the fulcrum is fucking amazing insights that clients understand as unlocking new growth for them, and creatives look at and realise I'm going to make the best work of my career if I do something around that. I think our voice comes from our insights and our ability to shape them into ideas.
Actually, just picking up, one thing I remember when CHI used to beat us, thrashers and pitch after pitch, was there's a process about finding those insights in a structured way. And they used to do these tissue workshops where actually get everyone together, get all the senior managers together, sit down, and almost think if you could feel at the end of it is somehow as a group you've come to that insight from a stimulus, as opposed to coming down from the planners have been working on it for ages and they've got this insight. It's more of a, here's loads of ideas, and if you can fully own that insight, it's going to be more powerful than it is just being presented to you. Yeah,
but they've got to be good insights, and it doesn't sound to me like a bunch of people getting together in that sort of forum and talking to themselves necessarily delivers the sort of stuff that comes from the real world and shapes really, really good communication.
At least you're structured. You can create a facade of actually you found the insight and then they think they found it, which is always the...
Yeah, that's selling, and that's what they were very good at.
Yeah, that's really true.
The 3 R's of brand management: repackage, relaunch, resign. Now, the 3 F's of planning, what would be my 3 F's? My 3 F's would be frameworks, future, and focus. Frameworks, if you think about the success of planning years ago, as you said, Adam, when we do our archaeology, it was all about a new way of thinking about how we develop advertising. Everything's changing again and again and again. I think probably the really important thing of winning your second game, Adam, to my opinion, would be actually coming up with a really good, new, basic framework of how marketing, business, brands work as a fundamental. And actually, picking up something that was said by one of the speakers, in some respects, it's it's not about quantity of the brilliant ideas we have. I think it's about the quality of the conceptual thinking. So F for frameworks. Second, the future. There are no facts about the future. There are only opinions. Seems to me we are at our noisiest when we have fantastic opinions. And I would counsel us all, and I think it's really great that we've got the APG doing noisy thinking, but let's start having a lot more opinions about the future and what that means for our brands, particularly when we stop some of our clients from reacting to hype trends, the kind of trendemics that we're seeing everywhere. And lastly, for me, very, very important here, is focus differentiation, the transformative for power, which is what you've also said. So for me, how do we get into Adam's game too, and how do we start rethinking about frameworks, the future, much more actively, and actually being a lot more focused on differentiation? For me, that's at the heart of the question now.
Very good. I'm glad that came into a question at the end. I'm going more of a comment halfway through, but so quick answers to this as we're getting towards the end. I guess if we begin with Richard and work back, because the question originally came from Adam's observation. So, Richard.
Well, as a fan of alliteration, and I think alliteration is my key piece of advice in creating planning of the future. I think what we're because I'm really passionate about this whole insight thing and revelation thing. But at our best, we do make the world a simpler place, and it's very, very scary out there. It's quite scary for agencies. It's petrifying for clients. And the ability to make the future look a little less like it, the cards are all stacked against the client by simplifying things and providing a plan and showing how it's going to work, and then depth charging that with some form of inspirational insight. That seems not a bad way of going about it.
I'd have to echo you entirely on that one. I think frameworks are reassuring for clients, and actually putting things together, even if it doesn't make sense, I think actually creating a sense of structure. I think you struggle to create a meta framework that's all encompassing. It's all. I think it's a misguided way of looking at planning. Respectfully, I think it's too difficult. One size fits all. I think the idea of creating frameworks and the broad, I guess, depends how you interpret the three Fs. I think it's in a way it takes about Newtonian planning, which is almost there can be a framework as one size fits all, i.e. the model and all that kind of stuff from the old days. I think it's kind of there's probably a multiplicity of frameworks which you only need to find the right one. But again, I guess it's all a bit complicated.
So I'm for frameworks. I think that's an absolutely essential thing. Was it 2003? Jim Stengel, CMO of P&G, then said the old marketing model is dead. We need to find a new one. Business has resolutely failed to put up an alternative. And it's been 9 years now of silence. And I just think that's untenable. I think even if you can't put up one, you have to say, we think it's going to be one of these 2 or 3 things. And it's not just a journey without maps. This is the way it's going to work. And I think actually, I think Peter Field and Les Binet's stuff, within that, the seeds of a slightly contrarian view about actually the future's not going to be as different as the past, as everybody says it is. And I like that rather contrarian view. So I think there are the basis in quite a lot of interesting bits of data around for what that model should look like. I'm just not seeing the business stand up and offer that, and it needs to. So I completely agree.